Hello and welcome to Please Expand. I'm Mahilius, and today Giulia is with me once again in in the studio.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for having me again. So, what are we going to listen to today?
So today we're going to listen to Mary Hollingsworth discuss her most recent book, Princes of the Renaissance.
Okay, so why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about Mary and her background?
So Mary has a very interesting background. That's partially why I chose to read her book. So Mary has a BSc in Business Studies,
Oh, wow.
as well as a PhD in Art History. And her PhD was on the role of the patron in the development of the Renaissance. So you can see quite nicely how the two go together, business studies. And she's written widely on the Italian Renaissance, and this is her most recent book on it.
Okay, and can I also ask you to introduce the main themes of the book? Just to tell us everything we need to know to be able to follow your chat with her.
So, the book starts in 15th century Italy. It deals with most of the city-states in Italy, so we learn about the Kingdom of Naples, the Papal States, Ferrara, Modena, Florence, Venice, Milan, Mantua, and Padua. So they all get a look in, and it's thematically structured, and so each theme tells a different story. So there are a bunch of characters in each theme, and the stories unfold according to these themes, and that's how you learn about each character and the different dynasties. And as the book progresses and time goes forward, you see how that person's child grew up to become this person, and they've done this, and then all this is told with respect to the dynastic politics of the region, and more importantly for the book, I think, how all these princes and their artists went about creating all these works of art of the Renaissance that we admire so much.
Okay, so two quick questions. One, what's the time frame then?
It begins mid 15th century, so around 1450s, 1440s, and it ends in the late 16th century, so about 1580s. So about 150 years.
Okay, and second question, just to set up the vibe. If you had to describe the period after having read the book and spoken with Mary in 3 words, what would they be?
Bloody.
Okay.
Colourful.
Okay.
And competitive.
Okay. That's enticing. Is
Yes.
enticing the word we want?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. No,
With bloody and
it makes for a great story.
wonderful. Then we're looking forward to hearing it.
Yes. So, without any further ado, Mary Hollingsworth and Princes of the Renaissance. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Please Expand. I'm Mahilius, and today I have Mary Hollingsworth, historian, with me on the podcast to discuss her most recent book, Princes of the Renaissance. Mary, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's your book is really beautiful for a book on the Renaissance. I think it looks like it is about the Renaissance, just the way it's presented.
It's true. The publishers did do a really fantastic job. I mean, finding the pictures, but it's also the fact that they're in the text and not separate
Yes.
sort of special art with a capital A. They're sort of just everything's just all together. And I think somebody really understood. The designer really understood about designing, because it's quite unusual, the design of the book with the different colours and the sort of. But it does make a difference, and it certainly livens it up.
It makes a huge difference, especially with books that talk about art and architecture. It makes a big difference when you can see the objects you're talking about. It makes the points that the historian is trying to make all the more pertinent. So when I was researching about Princes of the Renaissance, I came across your website, and I found that you have a master's in business studies and a PhD in art history. And that struck me as a particularly interesting combination, especially since you've written so much on the nature of patronage in Renaissance Italy. has that combination of business studies and art history given you particular insights
Oh,
into
I
this?
think it's changed. It definitely. It wasn't. I didn't really choose to do business studies. It was slightly. I was. It was. It's a long story and not very interesting. But I did think I'd rather wasted 3 years until I started doing art history. And business studies. Everything is about money, and everybody. The question people endlessly ask. The more you're paid, the more you're worth. I mean, that sort of mentality. The more what profit mentality, I suppose. And art historians just don't do money. They just don't understand it at all. And so the questions I was always asking myself when I was doing my research was, who benefits? Who is the person? I mean, what is the point of paying for all of this? And suddenly I realised that everything was actually not quite what other art historians necessarily thought it was, and that there was another way of looking at it. So I got to this by analysing wage rates, by the way, which is one of the more amusing aspects of my research. I think spending hours analysing wage rates, but it was very revealing because the importance of the way that money actually is important, particularly in Florence, which was an exclusively which is where I did most of my PhD research. It's just exclusively mercantile community with people whose entire mentality was orientated around money. So yes, it had a huge impact, and that's why I ended up looking at patronage of Renaissance art rather than, I don't know, patronage and to some extent production, rather than the stylistic kind of history that or attribution or whatever that people are more normally interested in. So yes, it had a massive impact on me.
I don't know much about this field, so is there something particular that this way of looking at things revealed when sort of thinking about the history of Renaissance art?
Um, Well, in the sense that if you look at painting, you can and think of it from the patron's point of view rather than from the artist, the way the artist created it. If you think about the way that what the patron wanted to get out, did he get out of this work what he wanted, and what did he want in the first place? You suddenly start looking at it in a completely different way. I mean, both ways are valid, and actually a combination of ways is very useful. And the two interlock and intermesh, and it's not either or, but it is. I felt a very well. It was something that I just started doing, and
Yeah.
it was good because I got a PhD. It gave me my PhD, so
Yes.
can't complain.
No. And the Renaissance it's one of those moments in history where we've all heard about it, but I I have to confess, what exactly is the Renaissance? In particular, what I'm wondering is, what is the world that is being left behind, and what is being embraced when we're talking about Renaissance art in this time period that you're writing about?
Golly, how long have you got? um, well, that's a very difficult question to answer because
Sure.
the implication is that there was one movement, and that is the implication of the word Renaissance, is that it was just one steady movement. And I argue that it's a completely different a sort of jagged progression and different speeds and different things in different places because of the patronage factor. But I suppose at sort of broad level, it is a movement that goes well back into the 12th century, where people started looking again at the idea of the Roman Empire, which was did possess, if you like, most of Europe, and certainly Italy has a complete, that is the Italian heritage, and the realization that there was this past that actually existed because the buildings still exist. You could still see in lots of different, not just in Rome, obviously, you could see it in Rome, but all over, sort of quite small places. Like Ancona had a massive Roman arch. Anything with a Roman tradition, anything that had been a city or a town in Roman times had its monuments and had its infrastructure. The sort of the roads that went across Italy. We have roads here. Roman roads, but the roads that run across Italy. The culture was still there, and the stuff. The coins and things were still in the ground. You'd plough the field and find the coins, sort of shards, and I mean, it wasn't some kind of alien to them, it wasn't an alien culture in quite the same way as the Romans are to us. I mean, it's quite exciting to discover, a Roman pavement, but in Italy it is, I mean, just there are hundreds of them kind of thing. It's just part of so they rediscovered their heritage in a slow way. And also you've got to remember, it goes at the same, it's a time when Italy takes off as as a mercantile entrepot of Europe. Suddenly the Italian merchants, so particularly the Venetians and the Genoese, and then the Florentines, are people, are trading across. They're the people who are making money. They're the link between the Middle East and the cultures of Northern Europe. But suddenly money is much more available. People are buying things. The demands, everything goes up. The other point is that the papacy is not in Rome at this stage. It's in Avignon, under the control of the French kings, which gives them, so there's even more reason for sort of moving stuff up and down and trying to give. And the Italians were very keen. Oh, sorry, the Italians are not a nation at this stage. They're just a collection of city-states. But they're looking for their own identity, as opposed to being under the thumb of either the emperor, or the Pope, which is what they had been up until then. So that is a sort of not necessarily terribly helpful answer. But the point is, it's not just art, and art is ultimately the last thing that gets affected. It starts out in sort of the revival of the cultural life of ancient Rome, and by definition also ancient Greece, because in the sense that the ancient Romans vastly admired ancient Greece, and claimed to source their stuff, their ideas and their culture which they did, from that of ancient Greece. So that comes along as well, is what I'm...
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, we are talking about the Italian peninsula, which right now is this collection of states. You mentioned many of them already. There are all these famous ones: Florence, Milan, Rome, Venice. Not Rome, sorry, the Papal States in this case. And they've all got their own distinctive identity, but at the same time, they're understanding their heritage in a way that implies certain uniformity.
It's quite interesting the way that I think it's probably their medieval experience that gives them the ability to identify themselves as distinct from each other, because the city-states before the Renaissance, for example, they all had their own patron. They were Christian ultimately. They were all Christian together, but they had their own patron saints and their own pattern of feast days. They celebrated the major feast days in all the places, like sort of Easter, for example, but that each town had its own special kind of, I don't know, I feel like Christian calendar. So in Florence, for example, they celebrated there were dates, quite obscure feasts, like the Feast of St. Barnabas, which isn't particularly well known, but it's because there was a particularly impressive military battle victory on the feast day of St. Barnabas. So they continued to, they used that day as a special day to remember their heritage. And over the years, that sort of adds up. And then if you just add in, because of course they are still Christian in the Roman period, I mean in the Renaissance period, you just then add in. So Verona, for example, would have which has an amphitheatre, was the birthplace of, I can't remember, I think it's Livy, the feast, their feast day is somebody else. And, it all, just a minute, it's sort of, so they enabled them to continue to be independent and completely individualistic. And also competitive, I should say. So competition has quite a lot to do with it. Oh, I'm not going to be Sienese as the Florentines. Oh, I refuse to be Florentine. So local competition is quite important.
Right. Yeah. And do these distinctive identities also mean that you get different pockets of Renaissance in each of these places, or is that more uniform as it develops?
No. That you do get. That's exactly what you get. But the important point is that it's not the same in every place. It's sort of, they're similar patterns, and you can draw similarities, but they are massive generalities. If you want to actually understand what's going on, I mean, think about it from sort of most academics will concentrate on most art historians concentrate maybe on their painter or on a particular locality or a particular type of I don't know, statue in a certain time and place limitations. So, but that doesn't, unfortunately, bring everything. That's good in depth, but it's not. It doesn't give you the breadth picture, and the breadth picture is not uniform. So the Renaissance happens much later in Rome, for example, because the popes aren't there, and when they do come back, they haven't got any money.
Right. Okay.
If that's simplistic, but
yeah. Okay, and just and what exactly is it that these princes are patronizing? Paintings, temples, but it's not just that. It's medals with their faces on them as well.
It's everything. It's painting. It's paintings, architecture, and sculpture. But it's also, and art historians don't look at this enough. Things like tapestries and I don't know, different maiolica ware. That sort of painted terracotta, beautiful terracotta plates. Vietnamese got a very good collection of them. Tiles. I don't know, homeware, musical instruments. There's all these things. Armor, that was another thing that they were quite. They got their sword blades from Toledo, but the Italian swordsmiths would make the decorated damascene handles. But these things are all, they're sort of, I mean, we call them the decorative arts, rather sort of snottily. But
right, yes,
it's all part of the same thing.
Yeah. Right, so these are all expressions of this new
and
idea.
Books, by the way, I should have mentioned books and literary creations as well.
Okay, and looking a bit more closely at some of the people in your book, one, and you've already mentioned the sort of the papacy and the move away from Avignon in south of France to Rome. The figure of the Pope was quite fascinating in the context of your book. For one, because it seems that the Pope is essential. It's essential that the Pope likes you if you're a ruling prince. It helps a lot if the Pope likes you.
Helps an awful lot.
And, there are numerous cases when everything is going to hell, you're besieged, suddenly the Pope dies, there's a new Pope, and the weather's changed completely. Everything is rosy. And secondly, and connected to the political importance of the papacy, unlike the princes of the Italian peninsula, the papacy is not a dynastic title. It's not passed down the way, the title of duke is passed down. And so you've got these individuals that become some of the most important political players in this region for as long as they're in power. But as soon as they die, they and their families become significantly less important. And one of the things that I was intrigued to read was this development of the role of the Pope as someone who, beginning with, I think it was Pius IV, as someone who will spend some of their political capital. Pius II. Thank you very much. Pius II. Someone who will spend their political capital in trying to establish their family into the aristocracy. My question is, what impact did this changing role of the papacy have for the development of the Renaissance art in Rome, in Italy?
It gave the popes. I mean, the popes had it because of the way that they had to. What they were doing, which you very well described. Basically in establishing their families in the aristocracy, which they weren't, as it were, before. It gave the popes a particularly pressing, urgent need to create propaganda for their cause, and art is in a general sense, the art provided a massive propaganda tool for them, and so that's one of the reasons. They also needed to promote the power of the church, in a sense, to bolster their own claims for their families. And so you get them doing both things. I mean, you get them using art for both particular reasons, and sometimes it's quite difficult. Well, for example, there's Sixtus IV is one of the sort of famous patrons who not only patron but also nepotistic popes who spawned a complete dynasty. Basically, his nephew was Julius II, etc. And there's another, there's a sort of, and there. Right. But one of the things, he's responsible for the Sistine Chapel for building, and the the decoration of the lower half of the Sistine Chapel. So, but the Sistine Chapel, that is all about promoting the power of the church, the Sistine Chapel. It's not a family thing, but he built a library, for example, in the Vatican, which there's a fresco in there of him surrounded by his cardinals. Now, it's quite a debatable thing. Is it him surrounded by his cardinals, or is it him surrounded by his nephews? There's no question about it. They are definitely nephews, not disguised children. Some of the popes had disguised children, but Sixtus didn't. But there's a kind of there's an interplay. You can't say this is definitely dynastic and this is definitely papal, if you like, papal power. But the two things really merge together, and particularly in politics. What's the interests of the family versus the interests of the church? I mean, some popes are much more explicit about going one way or going pro-family. Sixtus IV actually was quite a big reformist pope. So, I mean, he was a Franciscan, a master of the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, and he had a vested interest in promoting church reform, which he tried and didn't entirely succeed doing, partly because he was promoting his own family at the same time.
So one thing that I was asking myself the chapter on Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia.
Yes, that's great.
He gets a lot of airtime. He and his family, they're very. Well,
I do. My basic academic research is on his grandson.
Okay, who was his grandson?
The son of Lucretia Borgia,
who
was called Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, who looked very like his grandfather and went into the church.
Right. Okay.
And was just as devious as his grandfather.
Well, yeah, precisely. So here you've got someone who, correct me if I'm wrong, but is quite openly promoting the interests of his family. He's giving his son Cesare all these lands, naming them the Romagna, taking away lands from other people. Saying that to one side, what I was interested in was the marriage of his daughter Lucrezia to Alfonso
Este.
Este. Thank you very much. Yeah, and for that marriage to go through, Alfonso's father had to be paid a lot of money. He wasn't just satisfied, and I suppose I was trying to understand the political intrigue there, because there isn't much in it for the Estes to marry into this family if Rodrigo Borgia dies tomorrow. If he stops being pope, there isn't that sort of political capital anymore.
That's because that's where it becomes. We've got it. That's where there aren't enough. That would have been precisely the conversation that Ercole d'Este, who's Lucretia's father-in-law, would have been having with his son Alfonso. What do we do? Do we go for short-term gain for long, or do we suffer in the short term? Because if Cesare had kept the empire, kept the Romagna, and Ercole hadn't gone with Alexander, then unquestionably he would have lost Ferrara, because it was only a matter of time before Cesare's armies took Ferrara. So you either lose Ferrara but stay clean, and if you see what I mean, or you gain an interesting daughter-in-law. But that was what was quite interesting, because what Ercole's solution was to send ambassadors to Rome, to envoys, I think they have to call them, rather than ambassadors, but send envoys to Rome, whose explicit task was to go and check on Lucretia Borgia to see what she was actually like, to see whether she was the sort of brazen, painted lady that everybody was describing her as. And actually she wasn't. She was rather a charming, kind of quiet girl. And also, really interestingly, when she married Alfonso, this is what I only recently discovered it. Unlike the Este and Ferrara have an immense tradition of patronage and spending money on general cultural things, and she didn't do that at all. She spent her money buying property, buying fields and things, and making money. And I just think that is so different. But yes. But there's, apart from sort of I mean, a sort of a kind of relatively innocent liaison with a local one of her, in-law cousin, her cousins-in-law. She wasn't a scarlet painted lady at all. So,
Yeah.
but that was the decision they had to take. I mean, that's just the question that. I mean, I can't say there isn't. That you can imagine they took it in en famille. That was something. And there aren't any letters describing the issue. So
Right.
there
I
we
mean,
are.
yeah. I mean that was
But it
actually
is
one
a
of my
dilemma.
favorite. Sorry.
It would have been a dilemma.
Yeah, it would have been a dilemma. I mean, especially because is it with the arrival of the next pope that the Romagna is taken away from Cesare?
Yes, yes. Technically, the next pope is Pius III, who dies after 2 weeks or something.
Okay.
But you're talking, yes, Julius II.
Yes, the
The first
warrior
thing he
pope.
does is I mean, because he gets elected by persuade. I mean, the Spanish cardinals were. I just sort of wonder sometimes about their brains. He made them endless, amazing promises, and he was never going to keep them. I mean, the moment he was elected, that was it.
Yeah.
Sure enough.
Yeah. The chapter on Alfonso and Isabella d'Este of Ferrara and Modena was one of my favorite chapters, actually. It's titled Survivors. And I think one of the reasons why I liked it so much was because they were such likable characters. Unlike a lot of the other players in this time, they were remarkably virtuous and decent people.
Yes, I think that's right. They were. And also they were. I think we're very lucky that the archives in both places, Mantua and Ferrara, have survived substantially in a way that the archives in Rome haven't. I mean, the archives in Rome were devastated in 1527, burnt, I think, in 1527. But in Mantua, oddly, they threw away the account books and kept the letters. But in Ferrara, they kept both. So we've got the letters. But it does mean that it's a little bit difficult, but you have got a slightly more human. It's possible to put a much more human gloss on Isabella and. Mind you, having said that, it's also possible to do it with the Sforzas in Milan. And let's face it, Ludovico Sforza. He may have commissioned The Last Supper, but that, frankly, that was not a nice man.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wondered though, because when you introduced them, Alfonso and Isabella, you set out the political setting, and they're this Ferrara, Modena, and Mantua are these two very small city-states sandwiched between these powerhouses, Venice and Milan, and they're always trying to stay neutral and not get involved in any conflict between them. And I was wondering whether they're sort of decent people also because of their circumstances, because if they try to be maybe aggressive or too passive, that they would have been gobbled up. Or
very definitely, no, that's absolutely right. They would definitely. They didn't need. It didn't work for them. Look, look what happened to Ludovico Sforza. It didn't work for them to be. It mattered that they got on with their neighbours and that they stayed out of the big squabbles, and they didn't join up with. That was another issue that presumably bothered Ercole d'Este in the choice of aligning himself with Rome, because that automatically put him on a collision course with A, Alexander's successor, and B, Venice. But yes, that is important. That is important, and that's also the lesson that Sigismondo Malatesta might have done well to learn.
Yes.
Because if he had been a little bit more common, a little bit less greedy, or a little bit less aggressive, and determined to enlarge his state, he would still he would have kept it.
A general rule of thumb, at least from your book, seems to be that aggressivity doesn't really pay off in this peninsula.
Exactly. That's absolutely. I think we could tell Putin that. But it rarely. I mean, you could certainly tell Hitler. I mean, it really, over pushing your luck isn't always a very good idea. I mean, you can. What you need is the sense that you need to be aware of your maximum boundaries.
Yeah.
And very definitely particularly in Renaissance Italy, where there was very little, it wasn't a big place. There and the boundaries were quite sort of, I don't know what's the right word, tightly controlled. I mean, it wasn't. If I mean, the important thing was the survival strategy, which Mantua and Ferrara, because of the ways in which they intermarried and made marital alliances with other small states. They could also, it meant that they had backup. Venice tried to take over Ferrara. There were plenty of people ready to stop that. It was only at the very end of the 16th century that Ferrara got seized, I don't know what word you used, usurped, I don't know, by the Pope, on the grounds that there wasn't a legitimate heir, and they fancied owning Ferrara as well as the rest of the papal states.
Right. Just staying with the Este just for a bit longer. Isabella d'Este stands out as well in your book as a remarkable woman in this time for her, I suppose we could say, her initiative in deciding what kinds of Renaissance projects to patronize, what kinds of artists to invite into her court. Was she, is this indeed the case? Was she this sort of particular individual? And what was it about her that enabled her to be in this way?
I think one of the interesting things about interesting things about Isabella d'Este is the way that she herself was closely involved in all her projects. She didn't just hand an artist some money and say, do this. She was quite annoying. I mean, if you watch, Perugino was trying to, paint a picture for her, but he was being a bit slow, and he wasn't in Mantua. He was in Rome, and she used to, she'd write to him sort of letters saying, no, you're doing this completely wrong. You've got to check this, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do that. And you could see he was just going, I think I'm just going to tell her to go away. But that's in a way she I suppose goes back to the boundaries, but she was really pushing the boundaries. I mean, she was quite exceptional. It's not just because of she's not exceptional just because of the surviving documentation that we have for her. She was exceptional for the time as well. As a patron on on the scale, I'm trying not to use the word masculine scale because it wasn't really quite like that. But she had ambitions, just like her husband, to be known for her art or art collection and her antiquities, and she was an interesting person, although, as I say, irritating.
Yeah, she sounded fascinating. And just to consider sort of Alfonso d'Este or her husband, Federico Gonzaga, they were the Renaissance prince. A large part of what they're doing is politics and war. I was intrigued to read that I just assumed these princes would gain all their money from taxes or some form of taxation, but they're actually employed by other states to lead their armies in condotas, right? Like contracts. But so there are these generals, there are these sort of martial figures, but at the same time, they're also spending time investing in the patronage of arts. I mean, was this the sort of archetypal Renaissance prince, or were more people sort of martial and others were more about the art and humanism?
I think certainly in the 15th and the early 16th century, I'm trying to think, I'm saying most of the princes, because Leonello d'Este wasn't a great fighter, nor was Borso d'Este, but by and large, they fought all summer. I mean, and sort of did the arts in the winter.
Right. Okay.
Well, a bit. That is a massive sort of.
Sure.
I mean, but they were involved. I mean, they were obviously involved. But there wasn't any fighting in the winter. Mostly fighting stopped during it was quite tricky fighting in the snow and.
Yeah. And just to this is a very silly question, I think, but it's a question that I can't really give an answer for myself that I'm satisfied with. We talk about these figures commissioning paintings or cycles of paintings or tapestries, and in these tapestries and paintings are depicted sort of either mythological events in the past or real events that show important sort of events for the family. And all of these works of art are meant to work towards buttressing their prestige and their legitimacy as the rulers. And from a very flat-footed sort of standpoint, I just thought, it's a bit odd that you should have more legitimacy just because you're commissioning a painting which shows you having more legitimacy because your ancestor came from Troy or something. No, so how exactly did it work? What was the thinking when someone did this? What did other people think of it when they saw it?
That's an interesting question. I would say the important point about it is that the concept of the business behind choosing a past event to legitimize your own position is something that is done at one level. It's the way people, not so much theologians, people. It's the way that people looked, for example, at David. I'm thinking of King David, King Solomon, David, and son of Solomon. Is perceived as a precursor of Christ, and there is a pattern of you look at the life of David and you can compare it to events in the life of Christ, and they're this kind of pattern of pairing, if you like, in the Old and New Testament is quite an important one, and it is the same pattern as that. And I wonder, but I don't think it's quite. I think it's very subconscious, this idea that you go back to the past to legitimize the present, because we simply don't do it. You can't really, but you can't say, I'm the great grandson of, I don't know, Wellington, and therefore I'm going to be a brilliant general. Nobody would believe you. Do you know what I mean? It's completely different now. I mean, meritocracy is a very definitely a different mentality, and it's something that's vanished from our well, certainly from Western European culture. That idea that you're the descendant of some, that you can validate a predecessor, use your predecessor to validate your own. But I think that's what it is, and I think it's probably quite an important point. This goes back to your very first question about the Renaissance, because I think that goes back to the concept of validating. Mantua, in a sense, validated its own position because it was, it had been a town for all that. It had been independent, a town, all that time before the Pope, before the papacy, and before the Holy Roman Emperors took over. That going back to your first question, the prequel is the fact that the 10th, 11th, up to the beginning of the 12th century, Europe, Italy was just fought over by the Holy Roman Emperors from the north and the Pope in the south. And it's why you get some amazing, the emperors in Sicily. It's one of the reasons why Sicily is even, another sort of, yet another layer of culture in Sicily that, to match all the other layers. But it is quite an interesting situation. It's not, but that's all I can't, it's a mentality thing.
Yes. Okay.
That we don't understand because we don't have it any longer.
Do you think also the fact that they're commissioning these very expensive things also play a role in granting them sort of prestige and legitimacy, just regardless of the content, just by virtue of being able to commission this kind of stuff?
No, absolutely. The really key thing is that the whole key to Renaissance society is display. The grander you were, the bigger your entourage. The grander you were, the more wonderful your clothes were, or the more, to a really basic level, the bigger the better your horse was. It was actually, although, if you know about horses, you can tell the difference between what's a very good horse and what's not a very good horse. You can understand, but they could all do it then. Everybody understood. Somebody riding a particular type of horse, was clearly different from somebody riding, a nag. a mule, which we think of as a slightly, not a good, a slightly insulting animal, in fact, was a status animal in those days. Mules were really expensive. Don't ask, I cannot understand why, but they were. And that was one of the really interesting things about researching I've done on Hippolyte d'Este, is just the cost of everything. And people could tell the difference, and people chose to wear. The different dyes were much more expensive than others. So black, bizarrely, was a very difficult colour. Well, if you think about it, we probably know, black was a very difficult colour to dye properly, to make it really black.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was more expensive than, say, green.
Right.
But people knew that then, and people knew that, I suppose it's the only equivalent I can think of now is that, if you see somebody driving a Ferrari, you look at them, not necessarily that they're better, but you know that their cars cost more than a white van.
Right. Yes. Okay. So actually, on this idea of display, one of the city-states that really stands out is Venice, because Venice is very different to all the other places in the peninsula.
Completely.
And I want to talk about Andrea Gritti as well. Fascinating figure. But before we talk about him, why is Venice different? Why is Venice different in the way it embraces the Renaissance to the rest of the peninsula?
First, Venice is never Christian. Sorry, I could rephrase that. Venice was never Roman. It was always Christian. It was founded in the Christian era. Secondly, it was founded by people who were escaping from Italy, and so that it's quite deliberately positioned so that it's literally difficult to, it was off the sort of, you couldn't, in the days before the bridge, and you had to sort of row over or sail over the lagoon to get to Venice. It was very defensible in that sense, and its culture is completely different. It always looked east, never west, and its tradition of links with the Byzantine Empire and for example, with the Orthodox Church are much greater. For example, there's a whole series of churches dedicated to saints in Venice that the West rarely hear of. St. John Chrysostom, for example, he is a Greek Orthodox, I think, saint, and there's a whole, there's just that tradition. The whole of the facade of San Marco is covered with loot stolen from Constantinople. But it's not Rome. It's Roman, but it's the Eastern Empire, not the Western Empire. And so that their mentality was always completely different from the rest of Italy. And they didn't really wouldn't go out of their way to say that they were Roman they weren't, because they weren't founded. And also at the end of the Roman Empire, they became part of the Byzantine Empire, which was ruled from Ravenna, that little sort of chunk of Eastern Italy, sort of up from Venice and down past Ravenna, was all part of the Byzantine Empire, not part of Western Christendom ruled by the popes. So they went into the 15th century in a completely different mentality. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that they turned during the 15th century. It's difficult to make it clear in the book, but they didn't invade any. They as long as they had just the little tiny coastal strip of Italy under their control, they weren't remotely bothered about what was going on, and they just cared about trade, keeping the roads open and the highways and that kind of thing. But during the 15th century, they decided they need more security, so they edged their way into northern Italy. So that's when they conquered, beginning of the 15th century, they conquered Padua, Verona, all those places quite close sort of to the eastern, to the Venetian seaboard, and slightly pushed their way in. And at that point, of course, they had to engage with Italian politics, which was sort of pit, I suppose is the way to describe it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes the thing that Andrea Gritti does was sort of grip the bull by the horns and say, look, okay, right, this is survival we're going to have to go pro-Rome. And it really is, it's extraordinary what he did. And then to do it in architectural terms as well. It's kind of art historian's dream. Seeing it sort of physically being used as propaganda. It's quite amazing.
And another thing that makes Venice seem different to the other places is the sort of the modesty that is required of the is it the patriarchs of the city. They're not expected to dress flamboyantly. They're not expected to display wealth.
Exactly. That's a mercantile mentality, not an aristocratic mentality, and that's another important distinction to make about Renaissance culture. Is that the mercantile mentality is completely, well, obviously, it's completely different because the aristocrats didn't work. That was sort of almost, you defined them by the fact they didn't work, and they disapproved of working. I mean, they just had pleasure, did pleasure, sort of, and fighting, and killed each other with lances and sort of. But the Florentine merchants in the 14th century, defined themselves as non-aristocrats, and they wouldn't do things like they didn't teach their children to ride. Sorry, they didn't teach their children to joust and things like that. They didn't believe in idleness. They believed in sending children to school to learn maths, reading, and writing, because that's what you need. You need to be able to record things. Whereas the Italian princes don't start educating their children until the beginning of the 15th century, or I could rephrase that, but they getting a serious education. And then they did get a serious education. So it is the mentality, the two mentalities are very different.
Yeah. Is it, obviously Venice changes, especially under Gritti, and is that because if you're going to engage in Italian politics in this Renaissance period, you have to play this game of displaying your wealth? I thought one interesting parallel.
No. That's a good point. I think it's not quite as simple as that. It's they have to play the game, the Italian political game, but they have the choice because of course they're merchants technically, but they're not entirely merchants because they're slightly. They're not. It's not quite as conventional. There aren't any aristocrats, for example, in Venice. It isn't quite as simple as it is in, say, I don't know, the rest of Italy. It isn't so. It isn't that. It's that because they come onto the mainland, and when one of the ways, obviously, if you take over land, you need to hold it, as it were. So the Venetians had farms and sort of estates on the mainland, and then they began to mix with people of their sort of background who were minor aristocrats, particularly in Vicenza and Verona, and picked up a whole new set of manners, if you like, so ways of behaving. So suddenly they stopped thinking that profit was the only motive. There was a sense that you had, the estate. You didn't buy your estate to make money. You did at the beginning, but you probably didn't by the end, and you certainly didn't. You certainly downplayed your involvement in trade and upplayed your status as a sort of rural landed. I'm trying not to use the word gentry, but it's that kind of thing.
Yeah, they wanted to. Yeah, and there was the same thing happening in Florence with your chapter on Cosimo the First. Was again this desire to stop being merchants and to be aristocrats.
Exactly, and one of the first things that happens is that their clothing changes, and they suddenly start wearing. They stop wearing the traditional long hood and coat and wear slightly more revealing items of clothing, sort of tight trousers and the tight hose.
Right.
They're always, but that is also an anti-church thing. So
okay, how so?
Because of course, it's not anti-church, but it's I could rephrase. It's not anti-church. It's just in opposition to. So the people in long coats and long coats are churchmen, and the people in short coats are lay.
Right. Well, unlike Venice, Florence is very much sort of smack in the middle of Italy. So, I mean, for large parts of your book, the Florentines are always playing some role. They're always involved in the politics. They're funding this army or backing this cardinal. So, it comes as no surprise that eventually they would aspire to, partake in the aristocratic world that they're constantly trying to get involved with.
Yes, it's true, and I think Cosimo's really fascinating. What's really fascinating about Cosimo is he doesn't just, he has the aristocratic title, of sort of Duke of Florence, but he's not happy. He wants to be, not just a duke, and a new one at that. He wants a title that puts him above all the other dukes in the on the peninsula, which is a kind of level of greed which is quite staggering. But on the other hand, it's clever because it's only a title, and it's and he gives him the grandeur. It's not the land that which is a quite an interesting point. He goes for the title, but of course, and the other interesting thing is that his successors have real problems. I mean, the emperor refuses to recognise it. The Grand Duke of Tuscany is a papal title, but not recognised elsewhere.
Right. Okay. You mentioned the Holy Roman Emperor. We should probably talk about Charles V, this figure that plays a pretty central role for most of the second half of your book. Aside from all the political and military exploits that he's involved in, he's, as the emperor, as the Holy Roman Emperor, he also has a role to play in the Renaissance in art. But he wasn't all that important in comparison to the more minor figures that we've discussed, or with respect to his great rival Francis I of France. We've been talking a lot about how patronizing artists and humanists was an essential feature, right, of appearing prestigious. So why was it that Charles V did not pay much attention, or as much attention as other people of his rank? And how did he sort of get away with it?
Well, I suppose it goes back to something you said earlier, which is quite an interesting point. He didn't need to promote himself. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, that was, that's it, really, isn't it?
Right,
I mean, and he didn't feel. I mean, he had legitimately, nobody challenged his title. He'd legitimately inherited, the kingdoms, the land that he. I mean, he certainly squabbled with Francis I about who owned which, but I don't think anybody disputed the fact that he was King of Spain, or Holy Roman Emperor, or ruler of the old Burgundian kingdom Duchy of Burgundy. But so in a sense, he didn't need to prove anything. That's one answer to the question. Another answer has got to be because he just had so much to do. I mean, he just travelled. I mean, I can't remember. I've written it down somewhere, but I mean, he made more journeys across Europe than anybody else. I mean, obviously with his court, but I mean, they're exhausting. These, I mean, you can get in a car now and drive sort of 300 miles in a day without hesitating. That's a long journey in Renaissance Italy when you've got to do it all by, on horseback. It's quite tiring as well, I should think. And he did. He ran. I mean, one of the things he was an exemplary emperor. I mean, he was, he worked. He was incredibly dutiful and took his duties very seriously. And he had quite a lot of problems to deal with in different places, particularly, and not places close together. He had a problem in Spain. He had a problem in Brussels. I mean, whether you go cross country or along the, I think you could go cross country through France, or you could go across the Mediterranean rather dangerously and then over the Alps to Germany, or you could sail up the coast over the Bay of Biscay to Antwerp. I mean, all three journeys are completely horrendous, whichever, and certainly couldn't be done quickly. So, I mean, it is quite an interesting. It is. I mean, I think because he worked, and the other thing is that he did delegate quite a lot. And for example, his sister Mary of Hungary, who ran the Netherlands for him, she wasn't seriously major patron. It's slightly unfortunate that virtually nothing of her architecture remains. It was all burnt either by Francis I or by Henry II.
Right.
And then what wasn't burnt by them was, destroyed by Wellington and the First World War. I mean, it is, but it's an area of land that people have fought over.
Yeah.
For centuries, the Netherlands. I mean, the whole, the sort of the Low Countries, the sort of, I suppose what you'd now call Benelux. But it is, that. So, I mean, there's much more. There was more, which was paid. I mean, she in a sense was his patron. I mean, she was spending his money, so in that sense, but also she was promoting his position and hers. As the power of Spain and the power of the empire.
Well, that's fascinating. And just a question on their relationship. Were they in contact on this issue? Would she sort of inform him of the kinds of projects that she was
I
beginning?
don't think so. Or we don't have any letters that are sort of massively. I mean, they did talk. They must have talked about these things, and they certainly both. They would go off. Right, they both adored hunting. So when he was up in the Netherlands, they would. They probably spend a lot of time talking about things. They certainly she was very. She used to put. She put on spectacular shows and sort of dancing and sort of, I mean, entertainments.
Right.
They must have talked about these things. They certainly would have talked about Titian, for example, because Titian didn't paint her, or he did. He put, well, sorry, we haven't got the portrait of her, but he did paint. He was Charles the Fifth. Sorry, Titian was Charles V's sort of official portraitist, but he also did an awful lot of work for Mary of Hungary, and they must have talked about what he was commissioning, what she was commissioning in his name, as it were. But it is a very good point. He didn't commission very much. And there is of course the palace in Granada, which is grander than it. I mean, we don't often go. I probably didn't see very much. And the other thing is, he died quite young.
Yes.
I mean, he didn't have a sort of, he wore himself out. I mean, he abdicated because he was so exhausted. Makes a change for a Renaissance prince to say,
It does.
"Sorry,
Well,
I've
it
had
does.
enough."
It really does. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you've got Francis I, who seems to play a massive role in the exports of Renaissance art into France and beyond.
Critical.
Right. And is Francis I then? Is he concerned about promoting his image and sort of the prestige of his court?
Yes, I mean, he really did have to. Nobody really challenged. I mean, Charles V didn't challenge his position as King of France, but they were rivals, and he couldn't own more. I mean, he couldn't sort of. Well, he wasn't going to try conquering the whole, Spain or something. Hopefully, I mean, I don't think he even in his wildest dreams thought of that. But he needed to show that he was better in another field, if you see what I mean. He had prestige, cultural prestige, even though perhaps he didn't have quite the same imperial stretch.
And is Francis I, is he an important figure in the development of the Renaissance in Northern Europe?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I would say he's one of the key figures because of the way that he just encourages Italian artists to move to France and stay there. To have French careers. The whole, nearly all of the gallery, his gallery at Fontainebleau is the three main artists who were involved in its construction and particularly in its decorations. That's Rosso and Primaticcio and somebody called Schiebeck da Carpi. A very strange name, but he comes from Carpi in northern Italy. He was the woodworker who did all the inlaid wooden panels and things, which is is an amazingly skilled work. But they were all Italian. They were all trained in Italy. So and he I can't even begin to. I mean, for example, he sent Primaticcio to Italy, to Rome, to make plaster casts of all the famous classical statues in the Vatican collection, which he then, at quite monumental cost, cast in bronze, and to decorate he decorated them in the gallery. He had them in the gallery. And that's where they originally intended for. And Catherine de' Medici moved them out into her garden because she also rather liked them. But wow. Catherine de' Medici is often considered to be the person that introduced Italian culture. There's always all the stories, everything that's remotely Italian in Italy is always her fault. But in fact, it's Francis I that starts it off.
Wonderful. Okay. Mary, thank you very much for...
Thank you. That was interesting.
It was fascinating. It was so... I loved reading your book. I loved looking at the pictures. It makes a change from having to go onto Google and to look at everything. And this conversation really brought it to life. I have just one final question.
Yep.
What are you currently working on?
What am I working on?
Yes.
Oh, God, that moves straight on from what I've just said. I'm writing a biography of Catherine de' Medici.
Fantastic. How is that?
Which is perhaps why I knew so much. No, it is. It's a really. I thought it was going to be very. I mean, it is very different. It's France, and you've got all her letters are in French, but it really is fascinating to see it just as a sort of, see how the cultures really are not so separated, despite what the French would. Well, so it's a very complicated story, Catherine de Medici, but it is an interesting one.
Fascinating. Okay, well, I look forward to that.
A year or two to wait. I've got to finish it this year,
problem.
but it won't come out till next year.
Okay. Well, Mary, thank you once again for your time.
Thank you. It was interesting.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hello and welcome back. That was Mary Hollingsworth and Princes of the Renaissance. I hope you enjoyed that. And now Giulia and I are going to have a little chat. Giulia, a modern Italian from the noble region of Friuli, which didn't even get mentioned once in the interview.
It never does.
What did you make of our discussion of Renaissance Italy?
Okay. Hi everyone to begin with. Let me start by saying that I found the discussion extremely pleasant to listen to. I found Mary just so fascinating to listen to. And perhaps compared to other episodes, this was extremely based on storytelling. So it was just extremely interesting to me to just listen to stories of these...
and the book is like that.
People that we can really relate to. And as a modern Italian, of course... It's easy to put myself in their shoes in a way, but on another way, in another sense, they are completely in a different world, of course. I think that the most interesting thing for me was to really reflect on the relationship between art and identity. She seems to emphasize in more than one place that in a moment of loss of identity after the Dark Ages, Renaissance is this period where Italians remember or pay more attention to their Roman origins. Yeah. And in some way, one may think that this would create a very cohesive movement, a nationalist movement, whereas what happens really is that each city-state undergoes their own Renaissance.
Right.
And this just fosters the differences between regions that are so deeply felt in Italy right now. I'm not saying that regions came out of that and that only, but of course it seems to be a moment where each region looks for their own identity, and art plays an important role in that.
Yeah. It's I never thought much about it until our interview. But I found Mary's point that each region expressed so the question, what is the Renaissance, is made more difficult by that fact that each region expresses its own Renaissance, and it has its own particular way of engaging with the past again.
And this, of course, triggers a few thoughts. Like, one is to what extent it was a competition. Like, was it an aesthetic competition? Were there rumors about what, I don't know.
I mean, there's a lot of competitiveness, right?
But on the other hand, I imagine that it wasn't just that, but also showing your power to your own subjects.
Definitely.
In a way.
Yeah. To the other aristocrats in your court.
Exactly.
Displaying
because that probably would justify your position.
Yeah.
And then, of course, one question is also how authentic or honest or
how authentic in the sense
in
how much did they like the art?
Not just like the art, but how, like, was it a mere instrument, or were they living in a world where art had a meaning, really? And again, of course, there's a whole other train of thought that leads us to compare what we heard you speaking about with Mary and the contemporary world. Because of course I'm sure some people would say, well, but it's the same today in terms of its identity making, and I don't know, the symbol of each country. It's actually their most famous, I don't know, building and whatnot.
Yeah. So on this, how honest they were, it's an interesting question, and we often forget that the Renaissance is not just about paintings and architecture. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we spoke about was books, medals, armor, a lot of stuff that we wouldn't necessarily think of as part of the Renaissance. But it's this whole collection of objects that are being created in a certain aesthetic. So I wonder whether the right approach isn't to think whether they genuinely found them all beautiful, but whether they genuinely cared about what they were invoking, the spirit they were invoking, the aesthetic they were invoking.
Or maybe simply they were honestly invested in it, and the way in which that manifests is exactly that they didn't even pose the question. Like, that's exact. Like, plates are to be decorated and handmade, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's not that you pose to say, "Oh my God, is this place beautiful? Oh, I'm so lucky that I live in this time."
Well, presumably, though, the artists would have contemplated these questions. But one wonders, I don't know enough about individual Renaissance artists and the kinds of words they used to describe what they created. I mean, what was the word beauty? Was that
would be
one of their main concepts?
We should ask Mary again.
We should, yeah.
And of course, this naturally leads to parallels between that word and our word, because of course now it's less about people in power funding buildings, though there's still a good part of that.
Yeah, yeah.
But we are, of course, deeply involved in lives full of art, and we are enslaved to fashion, and they are definitely identity-making features of our reality as well. So,
and what about branding as a whole? We would never consider it as art, a logo, or something that we associate with an individual. But it's definitely identity making in the way that you're talking, and there's definitely something aesthetic about it.
And it definitely signals different kinds of powers.
Yeah.
And I say different kinds because it's not just a matter of hierarchy, but it's also a matter of quality, of like the kind of power and
like what domain you're in.
Yeah.
The fashion domain, the tech domain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And moving on to another question, another point I found thought-provoking in your interview is at a certain point you ask, well, but to what extent could this identity-making process really work? Because, like, why would I gain more power, prestige, and above all, justification by depicting myself as an heir?
Yeah.
And I can never pronounce this word. Of the gods.
Yeah.
And there, from what I understood, the answer was, well, it's a different mentality.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah.
And
the mentality is something like, we all agree that legitimacy comes from our ancestors, which is obviously...
I guess it's all a matter of playing the same game.
Mm-hmm.
Something like doing that is allowed in our understanding because we need to know our sources, like our ancestry, and we know that it's impossible to gain knowledge on it, so we are fine to follow the flow and go with it.
And I mean, another main difference, so we sort of said that there might be some similarities with the use of aesthetic objects between nowadays and the Renaissance, but one big difference, and how these objects might strengthen someone's legitimacy. But a big difference seems to be that in the Renaissance, being a certain person, having these kinds of objects, was also a moral justification. It came with certain moral attachments that you were good or the right person to be there.
Oh, wow.
Whereas, because by virtue of being the ancestor of someone and showcasing that, it came with a sense of nobility and being better. Whereas now we've lost that sort of bit.
Yeah.
I also wonder whether there's any morality attached to the perception of a brand or something, whether anyone thinks there is a certain goodness by being the founder of Tesla, by being the creator, the inventor.
No, I think this aspect we lost for good. I don't think that any generalization can be made from a certain kind of look. Because even if you take King Charles's fashion, which has been the symbol of, I don't know, the old-fashioned, virtuous person.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now it's British aristocracy. Full stop. It's just like, oh yeah, you like fishing. I think it's detached from the virtuousness. But something we did gain instead, I think, is the room for individuality, of course.
Right.
Like now probably there's room for self-expression that is of the self, whereas which is not of my city or of my
your ancestors
and so forth. And if I may, something that is totally personal, but that all this reminded me of is we went to Vietnam over Christmas, and one of the most beautiful mausoleums was I don't remember the name, but was basically this place where the body of one of the 12th or 13th kings of Vietnam was buried, and the place is stunning. Like the architecture is incredibly gorgeous. It's on the side of a hill, and the decoration is just beautiful. And it took, of course, years to build, and inside it's decorated with these very tiny and super colorful pieces of ceramic that have been used as a mosaic on the ceiling and all for walls. And this king actually was considered, as far as our guide told us, was considered as being extremely weird and vain and superficial because he was so much into art rather than war, and he was putting so much effort in making things pretty.
He made a lot of designs himself, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to mention, but this place has been drawn by him. But this didn't give him any prestige in how history now is told. He's just the weird weak one.
Right. We spent too much money on art.
Exactly. And exactly, like this place is ridiculous. We could have done other things.
Yeah.
And so this makes me think whether the difference in which we tell the story in Italy has to do with why we have a different view of this kind of things in Italy. And one idea may be because it was a more general phenomenon, like more people did it. He wasn't no one was an isolated case, or whether I really don't know whether the legacy of it has been acknowledged more widely afterwards, or whether it's because there was the connection with the Roman roots, which gave robustness to this legacy, or whether our guide was simply dismissing the achievement of this king for no good reason.
Yeah. I mean, basically you're asking, why did the Renaissance occur in the way that it did?
Well, why...
In the place that it did.
But also, why it's recognized and admired, whilst I'm sure that something similar has happened, similar in terms of using art to make a statement and caring about that aspect of aesthetics and as a valuable thing, as a good thing, not just as a pretty thing. Why it hasn't been recognized, and
in the case of this emperor.
Yeah, and in other places in the world.
Well, to be fair, I mean, when we saw it, we recognized it as being beautiful, and we appreciated it.
Exactly, but I had never heard of it.
Well, because
and maybe I'm just ignorant.
How many people know about any Vietnamese kings?
Don't say these things. No, that's true, but I don't think that this is a good answer. Like, because the question then rises again: why don't we?
Well, I imagine it's probably because he wasn't part of this movement that multiple people were part of, and that eventually sort of encompassed an entire continent.
Exactly, but this I think raises other questions about the value of collective actions and whether it is fair that some actions are recognized and valued just because they're collective rather than individual, basically. Which, I mean, is the very old story in aesthetics. It's the very same, I mean, it's a similar question to why Duchamp's toilet is famous and not the other ones. I mean...
But I think also, this is just what happens when an individual goes against the whole cultural movement of a society. You're either going to be a revolutionary and change everything, or you're just going to be disliked for going against the grain and for sort of championing values that the rest of society doesn't recognize.
Yes, definitely, though I don't think this will satisfy me, but we can keep this for another time. To conclude, let me ask you, what is it that you will bring home from this discussion?
I think, so aside from gaining a lot of new knowledge of these wonderful characters from the Italian Renaissance, so the book is sort of thematically structured, and each theme has a host of characters, like 4 or 5 characters, and then the story unfolds. So aside from learning a lot about a lot of interesting people, I think what I will take home most from this book is this idea of the Italian prince as both warrior and patron of the arts, as people who are simultaneously engaged in something so destructive and violent, and with something that is delicate and floral and has nothing to do with war in many respects, and how both equally give prestige and construct their characters. How, you've got people like Sigismondo Malatesta, Sigismondo Malatesta, who had a terrible temper, as his name might suggest, and he just cared about war, and he wasn't really into the art stuff, and he was regarded badly, aside from the fact that he was an unpleasant person. it reflected poorly on him that he didn't invest in this kind of stuff, and he only built castles and fortresses. And you've got other princes like the Gonzagas of Mantua, and they're small people. They're kind of irrelevant. They have their condotas every summer and they fight, but all they have to increase people's opinion of themselves is their particular investment in art and in these projects. And that's a very interesting way to look at the Renaissance.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I find it very reassuring in a way, thinking that we're wired in such a way that we will never be able to detach ourselves from beauty one way or another. I just find it extremely soothing as a thought.
Yeah, it's difficult
against the fear of robotization and stuff.
No, we'll always have that. It's something that just shines and glitters when we think about it.
Yeah, I mean, and then you think about Balenciaga. but I do think that one of the best museums I've ever seen is the National Museum in Athens, exactly because there's a massive section on jewelry, and I was roaming freely there, and I was thinking, oh my god, I would wear all of them, and I felt so deeply connected with my roots by this sameness of taste, of aesthetic taste, in a way.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's it's soothing.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyways.
Great, Giulia. Well, I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And thank you for this wonderful conversation.
And thank you for interviewing Mary.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure for me. And make sure to join us next time, where Giulia and I will both be interviewing Michael Hunter on the decline of magic, which... and
the importance of supernatural beliefs.
Yes, on supernatural beliefs. So, thank you for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.